I was increasingly reading everything I could get my hands on, and I began to understand what I really was looking for was some sort of certainty, something that I could hold on to and say, okay, here's the truth. And then if I could just hold that one thing, kind of Cartesian, I suppose, in my thinking, one thing that I could hold on to for sure and build my world on that. And so I never found it, but it seemed to
Mm.
me that where I would find it would be in the hard sciences and in philosophy reasoning, because that seemed to be the central thing of humankind that would enable us to somehow find something to hold on to with really powerful evidence. Westchester University of Pennsylvania, which is where I ended up teaching after graduating. And I started teaching intro to philosophy 4 or 5 times a semester for 10 semesters. And
Mm.
so I went through meticulously the works of Plato over and over and over again, plus the field of philosophy, the history of philosophy. And slowly but surely, so many of those things started pointing me back to my Christian faith. And it's like, you abandon that? But and so, in Plato and Socrates, if we are to characterize him most clearly, was someone who said we human beings are fundamentally ignorant. That is, we don't know much of anything. And our problem is, as human beings, is that we overestimate what we think we know. And so, all through that, if I'm properly answering your question here, I would have been increasingly influenced by the Socratic view that so much of what we think we know, we don't know.
A better explanation of reality. Fair enough. So what started to crack in that after 25 years? Take us now to the second shift in your life and what happened.
My world started falling apart when my wife was diagnosed with Parkinson's, and everything started to fall down around
Mm.
me. And I had to start concentrating all of my attention and financial resources and emotional energy into helping her deal with the things she was dealing with at the time. And so my world, external world, the things that I thought I could hold on to and that I was competent to deal with, suddenly started falling apart around me. In 2000, my wife was diagnosed, I think it was 2013. In 2008, the financial crisis happened, and East Stroudsburg University held on to me for a couple years and then allowed me to teach a few additional courses as time went on. But eventually, they had to let me go because of financial reasons in Pennsylvania. They were no longer funding any the universities at the level that would have allowed my department to hold on to me. So I left there. I became a full-time mechanic at Sears Auto, and that was close to home, so I could still be home and help take care of my wife. As the years went on, my wife, it ended up being that the Parkinson's was an improper diagnosis. It was what's called Lewy body dementia, and she ended up in a home, full-time home, in 2015. And then suddenly, my world opened up like this chasm of freedom. And I don't know how familiar you are with like the philosophy of Jean-Paul Sartre, but he talks about freedom as this chasm that we walk into, and it's who we are, it's what we are. And Sartre's notion of freedom was so real to me at that time that suddenly I realized I was what I was in a new phase of life, and it opened up. And I don't want to be disrespectful here, but my first marriage was very difficult.
Mm.
My wife was a force of nature, and people talk about it's your way or the highway. There was no highway with her. There was only her way, and so that's how I lived most of my life. And I found my happiness. I found a way to deal with it. But suddenly, I had this open field in front of me where I was free in a way that I hadn't been for so many years. All of those intellectual threads, such as Socrates, that we are trying to find the answers to questions, and yet we're not recognizing that when we hold on to a particular worldview, we don't know that that worldview is true. And so for me, one of the fundamental realizations, and this happened in the process of writing my dissertation, so now we're back another 10 years. One of the most respected philosophers of the 20th century is the existentialist Jean-Paul Sartre. And Sartre said at one point, and he's an atheist to the core, said at one point in one of his more obscure writings, and I read it while doing my dissertation, he said, those who claim that, I'm paraphrasing here, that their atheism was something that they progressively discovered are lying to themselves, because it's a choice. It is not something that you discover. In other words, it's a metaphysical position. You choose it. And if you choose that, then of course, that's a parallel to choosing the Christian faith. And I began to see, as I moved forward in time through my wife's sickness and all the rest, this central issue rising up, that choosing to be a Christian, choosing to believe the evidence of the Bible, or choosing to be a materialist and an atheist and rejecting all of those things was a matter of choice. And if it's choice, then it's not a matter of one side having all of the evidence and clearly winning the battle over the other side. No. And increasingly, I began to see that both of them are positions I could hold with as much intellectual what do I want to say, clarity as the other. Like, both of them are legitimate positions, merely intellectualizing. So how can I choose between them? And that's kind of where I was around the time that my wife died in 2019. So when I was an atheist, I could look at every piece of evidence that could be presented to me, including all of the things that when I look, as we talked about in the ID, the future thing, at the evidence of the cell, and see all of those incredibly intricate machines that are constructed there, and still say, no, I believe that that just came about by chance and Darwinian processes. No matter which side you stand, you can justify your side and choose it. Now, when I stand on this side, I say, you're crazy, because the evidence really is far more profound here. But at some point, you've got to recognize when you choose one side or the other, you're making a choice and you're committing yourself to something. And you're going to have to see, as Plato says in, I'm forgetting which dialogue it is, but he talks about faith as being stepping onto a raft and sailing out into the ocean on it. You're going to have to choose which raft you sail on. And then you're going to see where it takes you. And I've been on both rafts. And this is why I called my podcast The Christian Atheist. I can think from both sides of this. I have both tool chests in my head. And when I lay them side by side now, you'd say, an atheist would say, of course, because now that's what you believe. And they're right at some level. But I say, I sailed on this raft. I see where it takes you. I've followed the logic. This raft has never once let me down. Not once. It did when I was back in Bible college because I was doubting things. But this raft that I have sailed upon is far more explanatorily powerful. It fits the evidence better. And you know what? At this point in my life, if it doesn't fit the evidence better, I'm still going with this side. Here. But I'm saying that when you hold to that side, suddenly everything becomes undermined. And now I'm using C.S. Lewis's arguments, but you're sawing off the branch on which you stand because you want to tell me that you're taking the scientific view. But under the paradigm that you're living, the scientific view is just one more view. And it could all very well be not true because it's just happenstance and molecules coming together. And there's no basis for it. Here, like Lewis says at the end of one of his sermons, I see the world through Christianity because how does he
By the
say it?
sun,
Yeah, by
right?
the
The sun
sun,
example. Yeah.
because by it I see everything else,
Mm.
and that's what the final Christian message becomes. It explains everything, and it all fits, and it all makes sense, and it justifies our most basic human needs for truth, for reality, for ethics, and for our emotional states. It's like all of those things for beauty itself. If we're going to anchor them and say that they're real, then we're going to have to believe in a transcendent reality, which is a supernatural reality, which is God. And then we start to say, okay, how do we learn about God? Well, we learn about God by studying things and maybe start look at the religious literature. And then you come across the Bible, and the Bible is this astounding book that absolutely, and I'm sorry, this is what I'm involved in now. Jenny and I are really getting into our Bible studies, and the more I read about it as a philosopher, a trained philosopher now, I look at it and I say, this has taken place over what, 1,500 years of writing. And all of these people tell a consistent story that ends in a very clear literary structure. And it's like, that's not possible. And so the more I study the Bible, the more convinced I become that it is, in fact, the Word of God.